The Galactic Council declared war on humanity and sealed its own extinction. The broadcast came at 3:47 in the morning, Earth Standard Time. Every screen on the planet lit up at once. Every radio, every interstellar receiver, every public terminal in every city on every continent. The signal cut through firewalls, scrambling protocols, and encrypted military channels as if they were made of paper. The Galactic Council wanted to make sure no human being on Earth missed a single word. I was sitting in the Earth Defense Fleet Command Center underneath Geneva when it happened. I had been awake for 31 hours. There was a cold cup of coffee on my desk and a half-read report about fuel supply chains open on my terminal. Lieutenant Owen Price had just walked in with a fresh report when the lights flickered, every screen in the room switched to the same feed, and a voice began to speak. It was calm. It was slow. It was the kind of voice you use when you want the person listening to understand that you are not angry, you are simply done. By order of the Galactic Council, representing 47 recognized sovereign species of the Orion Arm, humanity, designation Sol 3 primate, is hereby found in violation of the Consortium Expansion Accords, the Interstellar Biological Contamination Treaty, and the Population Stability Directive. The penalty for cumulative violation at this severity level is formal removal. All human vessels beyond the boundary of the Sol system are to stand down immediately. All human colonial settlements beyond Mars orbit are to cease operations. The species designation Sol 3 primate has 72 hours to submit unconditional compliance documentation to the Council Secretariat. Failure to comply will be interpreted as a declaration of hostility. The Council fleet authorized to enforce this decree is already en route. The voice stopped. The room was absolutely silent. I stood up slowly. I was 39 years old, a commander in the Earth Defense Fleet, and I had spent the last 6 years of my career studying Council military doctrine for a threat assessment division that most people in my government believed was wasted funding. I had written 4 reports warning that the Council's patience with humanity had a hard limit. Each report had been filed, acknowledged, and quietly shelved. Owen was staring at me. His face had gone the color of old paper. "Commander Mirren," he said. "What do we do?" I picked up my cold coffee, took a sip, and set it down. "Get me Admiral Hargrove," I said. "And tell the engineering teams to cancel their leave." Here is what the Galactic Council knew about humanity in the year 2387. We were small, we were short-lived, we were emotionally unpredictable, and we had been members of the Council for exactly 81 years. In galactic terms, that was not even a warm-up. The Vethsari had been members for 9,000 years. The Threll Collective had been around so long that their founding date was listed in Council records simply as pre-archive. Humanity was a new species that had arrived loud, spread fast, and refused to slow down when politely asked. That was the core of it, underneath all the legal language about accords and treaties. We had spread. In 81 years, humans had established 43 colonial settlements, converted 19 uninhabited worlds for agricultural use, and set up trading posts in systems that the Council considered buffer zones. We did it because we needed food, space, and resources. We did it because that is what humans do when they have somewhere to go. The Council looked at the rate of human expansion and ran the numbers forward 200 years. What they saw in those projections apparently frightened them enough to schedule our extinction. The specific legal trigger was a freighter called the Ardent Shore. The ship had been carrying synthetic protein supplements, banned under a Council embargo, to a human colony in the Kepler-62 system. The colony had been placed under that embargo for building a water reclamation facility on a planet the Council had classified as a protected prebiotic environment. The colonists had been slowly running out of food for 14 months. The captain of the Ardent Shore, a man named Patrick Hale, had decided he would rather face a trade tribunal than watch children go hungry. The Council used his decision as the evidence it needed. Humanity was willfully defiant. Humanity was ungovernable. Humanity was a problem that was only going to get larger. The vote was 44 in favor of the decree. 3 species abstained. None voted against. I learned all of this in the first 4 hours after the broadcast. My team pulled every document, every communication record, every Council session transcript that our intelligence networks had quietly accumulated over the previous decade. The picture it painted was not a sudden decision. It was a conclusion that had been building for 30 years, waiting for the right moment to become official. Owen came to find me at 6 in the morning, looking like he had not slept, which he had not. "The Security Council is convening," he said. "There are people pushing for compliance." "Of course there are," I said. "Commander Mirren." He lowered his voice. "We have 230 warships. They have 6,000. I looked at him for a long moment. He was 26 years old. He was smart, careful, and genuinely good at his job. He was also doing the same calculation that most people in my government were doing, which was the obvious one, the one that compared numbers and concluded that the obvious answer was to surrender. The problem with that calculation was that it was missing a variable. "Owen," I said, "do you know why humans are the only species in the Council that still runs into burning buildings to save strangers?" He blinked. "What?" "Every other species in that Council evolved as apex predators or as hive structures with collective survival instincts. They are either individually dominant or collectively rational. When they see a threat they cannot beat, they withdraw, regroup, or submit. It is the sensible response." I turned back to the window. The Geneva skyline was beginning to light up in the early morning. Humans did not evolve as apex predators. We evolved as prey. Small, slow, no claws, no armor, poor night vision. We survived because we refused to accept the conclusion that the numbers suggested. We just kept going. We kept trying things. We got creative in ways that the things hunting us could not predict. And somewhere along the way, we figured out that if you make yourself sufficiently difficult to remove, the things hunting you eventually find an easier target. Owen was quiet for a moment. "But there isn't an easier target," he said. "We're the target. Then we make it as expensive as possible." I picked up my tablet. "Get me the engineering teams. I need to know what our shipyards can produce in 12 months. And get me Captain Darnell Webb from the Asteroid Mining Division. Tell him I have an unusual request." The Security Council voted 7-4 in favor of seeking compliance terms. The compliance document was drafted by a team of lawyers working through the night. It was 60 pages long and it conceded almost everything. I did not file it. I am aware that this was, technically, insubordination. I am also aware that the 4 Security Council members who voted against compliance quietly made sure my filing delay was not flagged for 72 hours. By then, it was irrelevant, because the Council fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system and opened fire on an unmanned monitoring station before the compliance window had even expired. They were not actually waiting for our answer. They had already decided. The last thing I wrote in my personal log on that first night, after the broadcast, after the Security Council meeting, after the calls to engineers and mining captains and fleet coordinators, was a single line. I wrote it because I wanted to remember how I felt in that moment, not with fear, not with despair, but with something that I can only describe as a very specific kind of focus. We had been given 72 hours to disarm. I had spent 71 of them on the phone with engineers, pilots, and every clever person I could reach. The last hour I slept. I slept well. I wanted to be rested for what came next. Because what came next was going to be the most human thing our species had ever done. The Council's first strike fleet dropped out of fold space at the boundary of the Sol system on a Tuesday. 800 ships. That was the number our long-range sensors pulled back, and for about 40 seconds, the entire command center went very quiet as people looked at that number on their screens and processed what it meant. 800 warships, each one between 2 and 4 times the size of anything in the Earth Defense Fleet. The smallest vessel in that formation outmassed our heaviest frigate by a factor of 6. Their combined weapons capacity, according to the tactical estimate our analyst Clara Holt put together in 15 minutes flat, was enough to reduce Earth to a largely uninhabitable rock in approximately 11 days. Clara delivered this estimate in a flat, calm voice, because Clara was that kind of person. Then she asked if I wanted the breakdown by ship class. "Please," I said. I was not actually listening to the breakdown. I was watching the fleet's behavior on the sensor feed. That was the thing that mattered. Not the numbers. The behavior. The Council fleet had arrived at the outermost edge of the system, past the orbit of Neptune, and they had stopped. They were sitting there in a formation so clean and geometrically precise that it looked like a parade arrangement. Running lights on. Every ship broadcasting its designation on open channels. They had not activated weapons. They had not launched scouts. They had simply parked their 800 ships in a perfect display formation and opened a communication channel. Then they waited. Owen was standing next to me, watching the feed. "They're putting on a show," he said. "Yes," I said. "They want us to see the numbers and give up before they have to do anything." "Yes." "Are we going to?" I turned from the screen and walked to the back of the command center, where Captain Darnell Webb was standing with 3 of his asteroid mining engineers and a tablet full of schematics that would have made the Council's legal team collapse from shock if they had known they existed. Darnell was a large, quietly spoken man who had spent 20 years driving mining vessels through the asteroid belt. He was not a soldier. He was something considerably more useful at this particular moment. He was a man who knew every rock, canyon, debris cluster, and navigational blind spot in 400 million kilometers of asteroid field as well as he knew his own reflection. "Are we ready?" I asked him. He looked at his engineers. One of them, a young woman named Fiona Cole, gave a small nod. "Been ready for 9 months, Darnell said." That was the truth. The moment my compliance document had been quietly delayed, I had started making phone calls. Not to admirals. To engineers, pilots, and a very specific category of people who knew how to work in environments where the official solution was not available and improvisation was the only option. We did not have the ships to meet the Council fleet in open combat. We had never intended to. What we had was time, knowledge of our own territory, and a particular kind of problem-solving instinct that humans develop when they cannot afford to lose. Here is what the Council's 800 ships did not know. For 9 months, a rotating fleet of mining vessels, converted cargo ships, and remote drone platforms had been quietly seeding the asteroid belt with mass driver projectiles. Not weapons, technically. Just very dense, very precisely positioned chunks of metal, rock, and composite material, each one attached to a small propulsion unit, catalogued, logged, and set to a specific activation sequence. 10,000 of them. The Council's tactical systems were extremely sophisticated. They were built to track enemy warships, calculate weapons trajectories, counter known weapons platforms, and model the behavior of species whose military doctrines had been studied and catalogued over centuries of Council membership. What they were not specifically built to do was track 10,000 individually insignificant pieces of loose rock and metal drifting in a belt that was already full of loose rock and metal. The Council fleet began to move inward on Wednesday morning. They advanced in that same perfect formation, measured and unhurried, the way you move when you are absolutely certain that nothing in front of you presents a serious challenge. Our EDF ships, positioned at a defensive line near Jupiter's orbit, watched them come. The Council's admiral, a Vethsari officer named Commodore Rethavel, opened a channel to our command center and delivered a brief, courteous message informing us that compliance was still an option and that any vessels that chose to stand down would be treated according to Council detention protocols. I sent back a message that said we were considering our options. We were not considering our options. Fiona Cole was sitting at her console with her eyes on a countdown that only about 12 people on the planet knew existed. When the leading edge of the Council formation crossed into the belt's primary density zone, she entered a 6-digit code. What happened next was not a battle in any traditional sense. There were no dramatic charges, no ship-to-ship cannon exchanges. What there was, in the space of 9 minutes and 40 seconds, was 10,000 individually small projectiles receiving activation signals and accelerating along pre-calculated trajectories at speeds between 12 and 30 kilometers per second. The Council's point defense systems were extraordinary. They intercepted the majority of the projectiles. Roughly 63% of them were destroyed before they reached their target envelopes. That still left 37%. 61 Council warships were destroyed or rendered non-functional in those 9 minutes and 40 seconds. 14 more were severely damaged and fell out of formation. 3 attempted to return fire and struck their own ships while trying to track a threat pattern that came from every direction at once. The Council Tactical Command went silent for 4 minutes. 4 full minutes of no communication. Clara Holt timed it precisely because she was that kind of person. Then Commodore Rethavel came back on the channel. He did not sound calm anymore. "What was that?" he asked. He was not asking me. He was asking his own staff, but the channel was open. I heard it clearly. And I noted, with great interest, that the word he used in his own language, which our translation system rendered as "what," carried a secondary connotation that was closer to how and why simultaneously. He was not angry. He was genuinely confused. The Council fleet had arrived expecting a surrender or a brief, conclusive engagement with an outmatched opponent. Their tactical systems could model human military doctrine because human military doctrine, for 81 years, had been built on Council-approved frameworks. We had learned warfare from the species that were now trying to remove us, and we had always played by their rules, because their rules were the only ones we knew. But I had not built this trap using military doctrine. I had called Darnell Webb, who had spent 20 years learning to move cargo through an asteroid field efficiently, and asked him what the most dangerous thing in his environment was. He had said, without hesitation, that it was the stuff you could not see because it looked the same as everything else. I had then asked him if he could make a lot of that. He could. The attack pattern bore no resemblance to any recognized military strategy in the Council's records. It had been derived, with some creative adaptation, from the documented hunting behavior of wolves on pre-industrial Earth: surround the target, attack from multiple angles simultaneously, and make sure none of the attack vectors are predictable from a single point of observation. Wolves had used this method against prey animals far larger and more powerful than themselves for millions of years. It worked because the target's defensive attention could not cover all directions at once. The Council fleet began to reorganize. They were disciplined and professional, and within 20 minutes they had tightened their formation, raised their point defense systems to full alert, and resumed their advance, more slowly now. We let them come. Because the mass driver projectiles had been the first layer. The second layer was Darnell's converted colony ships. 40 vessels, repurposed from the civilian fleet, stripped of passenger amenities and fitted instead with drone launch bays. Each one carrying between 80 and 120 autonomous attack drones, not the sophisticated Council-designed drones that required extensive sensor networks, but simple, fast, single-purpose platforms built in human shipyards from parts sourced from mining equipment manufacturers. They were not elegant. They were extremely cheap, extremely numerous, and they operated on a distributed decision system that did not require a central command signal. The Council's jamming systems were designed to disrupt centralized command signals. They had no protocol for 40 ships simultaneously releasing 5,000 individually autonomous units with no central frequency to jam. The next engagement lasted 22 minutes. By the end of it, the Council's first strike fleet had lost a total of 104 ships. They withdrew to beyond Neptune's orbit in a formation that was, for the first time, not geometrically perfect. I intercepted the fleet command chatter in the aftermath. My translation team worked through it quickly. Commodore Rethavel was not issuing orders. He was asking questions. His staff was providing answers, and every answer seemed to generate more questions. The dominant tone, across every communication, was not anger. It was not determination. It was not even fear. It was confusion. Deep, genuine, operational confusion. They had arrived to remove a small, fragile species that had been a junior Council member for 81 years. They had expected either immediate compliance or a brief defensive engagement following patterns they already understood. What they had encountered instead was something their models had no category for. I sent a message to Commodore Rethavel. One sentence. We have more layers. Then I turned to Owen, who was staring at the sensor feed with an expression that had moved past shock and was somewhere in the vicinity of cautious, stunned relief. Get some sleep, I told him. Tomorrow is going to be busier. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then said, the colony ships we converted. The Council is going to say we violated the Civilian Vessel Protection Accords. They probably will, I agreed. What do you want me to tell them? I thought about Patrick Hale, standing on the bridge of the Ardent Shore, choosing to carry food to people who were hungry because no one else was going to do it. I thought about the 14 months those colonists had waited. I thought about a 72-hour compliance window that had already been a formality because the fleet was already moving before it expired. Tell them, I said, that every hull we converted had already been seized under their embargo. They were Council property the moment the decree was filed. We just found a new use for them. Owen stared at me. Then, slowly, he almost smiled. Yes, Commander, he said. 2 years. That is how long it had been since the Council fleet first dropped out of fold space at the edge of our system, and if I am being honest, which I have decided I will be in this account because there is no other version worth writing. The second year was harder than the first. We had stopped them at the belt. We had pushed them back past Neptune. We had bought time, and we had used that time relentlessly, building ships, training pilots, converting every manufacturing facility that could be adapted toward the production of something useful in a war we had not asked for but were now committed to fighting. The pace of what humanity produced in those first 14 months was something that even I, who had believed in our capacity to adapt, found occasionally astonishing. But the Council was not one fleet. It was 44 species, and it had resources across hundreds of star systems, and it had been fighting wars, managing conflicts, and enforcing its authority for longer than our species had been walking upright. By the end of year 1, they had replaced their losses. By the end of year 1, they had studied what had happened in the belt and made adjustments. Their point defense systems were updated. Their formation protocols were changed. Their advanced strategy was slower, more careful, and far more difficult to exploit with the kind of terrain-based tactics that had worked the first time. They hit one of our outer colonies, a settlement called Harrow Station in the Proxima system, in month 14. We were not there in time. Harrow Station had 11,000 people. We evacuated about 4,000. The remaining 7,000 were given 48 hours to surrender the station or face bombardment. They surrendered. I read the surrender document 3 times. The station commander, a woman named Bridget Marsh, had written it herself. It was 2 pages long and it was, in its structure and its language, the most precise, dignified piece of writing I encountered in the entire course of the war. She gave up the station, protected her people, and included in the final paragraph a single statement that was not required by the terms but that she had chosen to add. She wrote that Harrow Station would be rebuilt, and that the people who left it that day would return, and that she wished the council officers who received her document good health in whatever time remained to them. I kept that document. I still have it. We lost 4 colonies in the second year. Each loss was different. Each one hit differently. And here is the thing I need to say plainly, because I think it is important and I do not want to dress it up: grief is not a weakness. It is not something to be managed or suppressed or used as a reason to hesitate. In humans, grief is fuel. Not because we are violent by nature, not because loss makes us reckless, but because there is a specific thing that happens to a human being when something they love is taken from them. They become focused. They become creative. They become willing to try solutions that a calmer, less motivated mind would reject as too difficult or too unconventional. The physicist Dr. Nadia Osei had been working on fold-space communication theory for 11 years before the war. The Council held a monopoly on the technology that made faster-than-light communication possible, and that monopoly was one of their greatest strategic advantages. If they could talk across star systems in real time and we could not, they could coordinate their forces with a speed and precision we could not match. Nadia's work had been theoretical, underfunded, and largely ignored by the agencies that might have supported it, because the conventional wisdom was that any attempt to replicate Council fold-space technology without their patents and manufacturing base would take at least 50 years. She solved it in month 19. She solved it because in month 15, the Council bombed the research station on Titan where she had been working, and she lost 2 colleagues who had been with her for a decade. She moved her entire operation into a repurposed cargo bay underneath a manufacturing hub on Ceres, worked with a team of 8 people, and produced a functional fold-space communicator using components sourced almost entirely from mining and industrial suppliers. It was not elegant. It was about 3 times the size of a comparable Council unit. It consumed significantly more power. It worked. I called her when we confirmed the first successful interstellar signal test. She answered from a workspace that looked like organized chaos, surrounded by cables and half-dismantled equipment, with dark circles under her eyes and a look on her face that I recognized from the mirror. "You did it," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I did." She paused. "How long until you need units for the fleet?" "As many as you can make," I said. "Give me 4 months." She delivered the first batch in 3. The Council's information advantage dissolved almost overnight. Where they had been able to coordinate 600 ships across 3 star systems with a single command delay of under 2 minutes, we could now match that across our own fleet. More importantly, we could relay intelligence in real time, which meant that the kind of ambush that had worked in the belt could now be coordinated not just in a single region of space but across multiple engagement zones simultaneously. I want to be careful here, because I am aware that telling this story as a sequence of successes is not entirely accurate to what it felt like to live through it. For every breakthrough, there was a setback. For every system we defended, there was one we could not reach in time. The Council was vast and experienced and adaptable, and they did not make the same mistake twice. What they continued to make was a different mistake, a deeper one that I do not think they ever fully recognized as a mistake at all. They kept expecting us to run out. They expected us to run out of ships, or pilots, or will, or ideas. They had modeled our industrial capacity. They had modeled our population base. They had modeled our known resource reserves. And according to those models, we should have been approaching the point of unsustainable losses somewhere in year 2, month 8. We should have been sending representatives to negotiate terms. We should have been, in the language of their strategic doctrine, exhausted and seeking resolution. What we were doing in year 2, month 8 was producing 30 new destroyers in our asteroid belt shipyards. In the same period, the Council repaired 4. Captain Leo Barrett, who ran the primary shipyard complex at Vesta, sent me a production report that month with a note at the bottom that simply said, "Tell them to keep coming. We're just getting warmed up." I pinned that note to the wall above my desk. In month 20, something happened that I had hoped for but had not dared to rely on. The Threll Collective, a fungal hive mind species that had been one of the 3 abstaining votes on the original decree, formally withdrew from the conflict. They did not join us. They simply declared neutrality and pulled their 40 ships out of the Council's enforcement fleet. The Threll Collective's withdrawal was not purely driven by sympathy. It was driven by something that our underground diplomatic corps, a loose network of trade negotiators, journalists, scientists, and cultural ambassadors that had been operating informally for decades, had been quietly seeding for months. The question was simple: if the Council would vote to exterminate humanity for expanding too quickly and refusing to be governed, what happened to the next species that grew inconveniently large? What happened to the one after that? The Threll Collective had nearly faced an extinction vote 300 years ago. They had survived it through a combination of political maneuvering and the sudden death of the Council member who had been driving the motion. The memory was not distant for them. Hive minds do not forget. Our diplomat to the Threll, a man named Callum Shore, had spent 4 months in patient, quiet conversation with their collective interface, asking no favors and making no demands, simply asking questions. What kind of galaxy do you want to live in 300 years from now? What does the Council's behavior toward humanity tell you about what the Council values? If humanity can be removed for growing too fast, is any species safe? The Threll Collective withdrew their ships on a Thursday. On Friday, we received preliminary signals from 2 other species indicating that they were reviewing their position. I told Owen this over breakfast in the command center, both of us eating something that was technically scrambled eggs but had clearly never been near a chicken. "We're making friends," Owen said. "We're making them think," I said. "Which is better?" In month 23, I authorized our first offensive operation outside the Sol system. It was a surgical strike on a Council logistics depot in the Tau Ceti system, a fuel and supply hub that serviced the Council's 3rd Enforcement Fleet. We used 8 ships, moved fast, hit the depot's storage arrays, and withdrew before the nearest Council response force could reach us. The depot was taken offline for 11 weeks. The 3rd Enforcement Fleet, which had been preparing to support a second major push toward the Sol system, spent those 11 weeks waiting for resupply. 11 weeks in a war is not a small amount of time. I stood on the bridge of the EDF carrier Resolute as we crossed back into Sol system space after the strike, and I looked out at the stars, and I noticed something I had not expected to feel. For 2 years, every decision I had made was about defense. About holding a line, protecting what we had, buying time. Every calculation was measured in terms of what we could afford to lose and what we could not. Every morning I woke up knowing that my job was to make sure there was still a humanity tomorrow. But standing there, looking at the stars after a successful strike on a depot 40 light-years from Earth, I felt something shift. We were not just defending anymore. We were reaching. And something deep in the part of me that is simply, irreducibly human, understood that reaching was what we were always meant to do. The Council had tried to stop it. They had tried to contain us, limit us, and finally remove us. But you cannot remove something that is still moving forward. You can only fail to keep up. I went back to my desk and wrote a message to Dr. Nadia Osei, asking her what she was working on next. She replied in under a minute. Something that is going to make their shields look like wet paper, she wrote. Give me 8 months. I wrote back, you have 6. She sent back a single word, fine. I slept better that night than I had in 2 years. The peace envoy arrived at the edge of the Sol system in year 4, month 2. They came in a single vessel, unarmed, broadcasting a diplomatic code on every open channel. The ship was Vethsari, long and white, with the Council's 7-pointed seal displayed across its hull in a way that was clearly visible on long-range sensors. It was the kind of entrance designed to convey safety and good faith, and under different circumstances, I might have appreciated the effort. I sent a 2-fighter escort to meet them and bring them to Orbital Station Meridian. Then I spent the transit time reading the preliminary terms document that their diplomatic AI had transmitted ahead of arrival. It took me about 8 minutes to read it. Then I read it again, more slowly, to make sure I had not misunderstood anything. I had not misunderstood anything. The Council's terms were as follows: humanity was to surrender all colonial settlements beyond the Sol system, returning those settlements to Council jurisdiction. Humanity was to accept a permanent cap on its total population, to be enforced and monitored by a Council-appointed administrative body. A Council governor would be stationed on Earth with final authority over any human policy that had interstellar implications. In exchange, the Council would cease military operations and recognize humanity's right to exist within the boundaries of the Sol system. In exchange for our survival, we would give up everything we had built, except being told how many people we were allowed to have, and invite an outside authority into our home planet to govern us. I printed the document, walked to the main briefing room, and called a meeting of every senior officer and department head currently on station. 17 people filed in and took their seats. I put the printed document in the center of the table and told them to pass it around. They read it. The room was quiet. People passed it along. A few people made small sounds. Not words. Just sounds. When the last person had read it, I said, thoughts. There was a moment of silence. Then Lieutenant Commander Ray Gibbs, who was in charge of fleet logistics and was not, as a rule, a person given to dramatic expressions, started to laugh. It was a short laugh. Surprised and slightly disbelieving, like a person who has just been told a joke they did not expect. And then Commander Priya Anand, who ran tactical operations, started laughing too. And then, one by one, everyone in the room. Not loud, not performative. Just the quiet, collective laughter of people who have just been handed something that is so detached from their experienced reality that their minds cannot process it as a serious document. I let it run for about 20 seconds. Then I said, all right. Let's talk about the response. The response was no. Obviously. But the form of the response mattered. I did not want to send back a simple rejection. I wanted the Council to understand exactly why we were rejecting it, not out of stubbornness, not out of pride, but because the terms revealed something important about the Council's understanding of the current state of the war. They still thought we were the weaker party. They still believed that the weight of what we had lost and the ongoing cost of the conflict would eventually make any terms look acceptable. They were offering us humiliation dressed up as mercy, and they genuinely seemed to believe we would consider it. They had no idea how wrong their picture of the situation was. I drafted the response personally. It was short. It said that we had reviewed the proposed terms, found them inconsistent with our current strategic position, and were prepared to discuss genuine terms when the Council was ready to approach the table from an accurate assessment of the situation. I included, as an attachment, our latest production figures, ships built, systems reached, allies moved toward neutrality. Not as a boast. As information. Then I authorized Operation Long Memory. The planning for Long Memory had been underway for 6 months. It was the most complex coordinated military operation our species had ever attempted. 14 separate fleet groups, spread across 14 separate Council-controlled systems, each with a specific target, each operating on a synchronized timeline derived from our Fold Space communication network. The targets were not cities or populations. They were infrastructure, fuel depots, repair stations, supply routes, command relay platforms. The things that made the Council's enormous fleet function. We were not trying to win the war in a single operation. We were trying to make an argument. The argument was mathematical. It was, look at what we can reach. Look at how far our ships can go. Look at how many systems we can touch simultaneously. Now compare that to your current resupply rate and your current repair capacity, and ask yourself how much longer your position is sustainable. It was the kind of argument that prey animals have been making to predators since before language existed. The argument that says, the cost of removing me is higher than you thought, and it is going up, and you should think carefully about whether the result is worth the price. Long memory launched on a Wednesday. I was on the bridge of the Resolute for all of it. The reports came in over 18 hours as each fleet group hit its target and withdrew. We lost 9 ships across the entire operation. The Council lost 47 installations and a resupply network that would take them an estimated 2 years to rebuild. In the middle of the operation, somewhere around hour 11, Owen came and stood next to me with 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee, from a plant someone in the hydroponics bay had been cultivating since month 3 of the war. He handed me one and we stood there watching the tactical feed in silence for a while. They're going to be angrier after this, he said. Yes, I agreed. Is that the goal? The goal is to make them look at the numbers, I said. Anger is a side effect. He thought about this. What happens if the numbers don't work? If they just decide to absorb the losses and keep pushing? It was a fair question. It was the question I had been asking myself for weeks, running scenarios in my head at 3 in the morning when I could not sleep. There was a version of the future in which the Council chose pure attrition, in which they accepted enormous losses of their own and simply kept sending ships until we ran out of ways to stop them. That version of the future was terrible and I did not want to think about it more than necessary. But I had also been reading Council history. I had been reading it carefully, with the help of 3 historians who had spent their careers studying alien political structures. And what I had found, consistently, across 9,000 years of Council records, was that the Council did not make decisions based on moral conviction or ideological commitment. They made decisions based on consensus, and consensus was driven by perceived advantage. The moment a significant number of Council members concluded that the war was costing more than it was worth, the consensus would shift. It had happened before, in smaller conflicts, in the deep historical records that the Council kept with obsessive thoroughness. It always happened eventually. The question was what it would take to reach that moment. If the numbers don't work, I told Owen, we make different numbers. We find new approaches. We adapt. I took a sip of the coffee. It was genuinely good coffee, which I appreciated in a way that is difficult to explain unless you have spent several years drinking the reconstituted variety. That is what we do. It is the only thing we have ever done that the Council cannot model, predict, or account for. Every time they think they have run out of options, they stop. Every time we think we have run out of options, someone in a cargo bay somewhere builds something that should not be possible. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Dr. Osei's new shield system. Among other things. The shield system that Nadia Osei delivered in month 28 was, to put it plainly, the product of a person who had been told by the Council's embargo that she was not allowed to have certain materials, and had consequently built the thing from different materials in a way that worked better. The Council's energy shields operated on a principle of uniform field distribution. Nadia's system operated on a principle of dynamic redistribution, concentrating defensive energy toward the point of incoming fire in real time. Against the Council's standard weapons profiles, it performed approximately 40% better than our previous shielding. Against our own weapons, which Nadia had quietly redesigned in parallel to exploit the specific gaps in the Council's defensive approach, it performed significantly better than that. The first fleet group to be retrofitted with the new system was the 7th, under Captain Abigail Croft. The 7th had been badly mauled in year 2 and had spent months being rebuilt. When they came back into service, they were a different fleet from the one that had gone in for repairs. Abigail sent me a brief message when the retrofit was complete. It said, "Ready. Point us at something." I pointed them at the Epsilon Eridani supply corridor, which was the primary resupply route for the Council's 2nd Enforcement Fleet. What happened in the corridor is a separate story. The short version is that the Second Enforcement Fleet subsequently spent 6 weeks unable to maintain its operational tempo due to supply shortages, which contributed directly to the Council's decision to pull it back for redeployment. But what I remember most clearly from that period is not the tactical result. It is something that happened in the Galactic Council's own session chamber, which our intelligence network, now considerably better resourced than it had been at the start of the war, captured in partial transcript. The Council held an emergency session in Year 4, Month 6. The session was closed and classified, but the first 8 minutes of the opening address were recorded by a monitoring system our intelligence teams had placed 18 months earlier. In those 8 minutes, the Council's Secretary General made a statement that I have read many times since. He said that the current conflict had moved beyond its projected parameters, that several member species had formally requested a re-evaluation of objectives, and that the situation required the Council to consider whether its original assessment of the human threat had accurately accounted for all relevant variables. He was saying, in the formal language of Council bureaucracy, that they had gotten the math wrong. They had looked at us and seen our size, our lifespan, our numbers, and our relatively brief period of technological development, and they had calculated a simple equation: small species, limited resources, predictable behavior, manageable removal. They had not accounted for the variable that does not show up in any biological survey or resource assessment. The variable that cannot be measured in ship tonnage or population figures or industrial output per capita. They had not accounted for what happens to a human being, or a human fleet, or a human species, when someone tells them it is over. In Year 4, Month 8, I was called to testify before a UN oversight committee that had some questions about several of my decisions, including the one involving the delayed compliance document, and the one involving the conversion of civilian vessels, and the one involving Operation Long Memory, which had technically been authorized without going through the full approval chain. I testified for 4 hours. The committee was divided. 3 members seemed genuinely angry. 4 seemed cautiously supportive. The chair, a former ambassador named Victor Cole, asked me, near the end, whether I believed my actions had been justified. I said yes. He asked me to explain why. I said that the Council had scheduled our extinction before we fired a single round. That the compliance window was a formality for a decision that had already been made. That the vessels I had converted had been legally seized under the Council's own decree. That long memory had targeted infrastructure, not populations, with the explicit goal of making the conflict's cost visible to Council members who had not yet concluded that the war was a mistake. He looked at me for a long moment and then said, "And the station in the Tau Ceti system, Commander? The one with workers aboard?" I had known that was coming. I had thought about it many times. I had thought about it at 3 in the morning in the dark of my quarters, lying awake in the way that you lie awake when you are carrying something that will not resolve itself neatly. I was unaware of the civilian presence when the strike was authorized, I said. When I learned of it, I had the operation reviewed and we adjusted our targeting protocols for all subsequent strikes. I carry the weight of that decision. I will continue to carry it. But I do not believe it changes the fundamental calculus, which is that a species fighting for its existence must sometimes act in the space between the available options and the ideal ones. Victor Cole wrote something on the paper in front of him. I could not see what it was. "Thank you, Commander," he said. "That will be all." I walked out of the chamber and into a corridor where Owen was waiting with a look on his face that asked a question without words. "It went fine," I told him. "Are they going to remove you from command?" "Probably not today," I said. They did not remove me from command that day, or the day after, or in any of the months that followed, because by then the situation had become too clear for the kind of political argument that might have supported the move. The Council was fracturing. Our fleet was growing. The species that had voted for our extinction were running the numbers and finding that the numbers no longer told the story they had expected. 14 Council member species voted in their internal session to pursue genuine negotiations. The remaining 17 voted to escalate. For the first time in 9,000 years of Council history, the body that had declared our extinction was at war with itself. I read the intelligence report on that session sitting in my office at 2 in the morning, and I felt something that took me a moment to name. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was closer to a kind of quiet recognition, the feeling of watching a slow process reach its inevitable conclusion. A stone rolling down a slope, finally reaching the bottom. I had not wanted this war. No one with any sense wants a war. But they had brought it to us, and we had answered it the only way we knew how, and now the thing they had built to remove us was turning against itself. I thought about Patrick Hale, on the bridge of the ardent shore, choosing to carry food to people who were hungry. I thought about Bridget Marsh, writing a 2-page surrender document with a quiet promise at the end that she would come back. I thought about Darnell Webb and Fiona Cole, standing in a command center with schematics that turned a liability into a weapon. I thought about Nadia Osei, in a repurposed cargo bay, solving in 3 months what everyone said would take 50 years. None of them were soldiers. None of them had set out to change the course of a war. They were just humans who had encountered a problem that needed solving and had refused to conclude that it could not be solved. That was the variable the Council had not accounted for. That was always the variable they never accounted for. I closed the report, turned off the light, and went to sleep. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. The final fleet came at us on a Tuesday. I remember the day of the week specifically because there is something about large, world-altering events that makes certain details stick in the memory with unusual sharpness, and the first thing I thought when the sensor report landed on my desk was that it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays had never been my favorite day, and this one was not improving the average. 1,200 ships. The number sat on my screen and I looked at it for a long time. Clara Holt, who had by now been calmly delivered impossible numbers for 4 years, brought me the detailed breakdown without being asked. 1,200 warships representing the 17 Council member species who had voted to escalate. The combined military force of what remained of the Council's hardliner bloc, everything they had, every vessel they could deploy, assembled into a single formation and pointed at the Sol system. It was enormous. It was the largest fleet assembly in recorded Council history, according to the historical records we had managed to extract from their own archives. No species, in 9,000 years, had ever assembled 1,200 warships in a single operational formation. Owen stood next to me and looked at the screen. "That's everything they have," he said. "Yes," I said. "They have no reserve." "No." He was quiet for a moment. I watched him work through it. He had been doing this for 4 years now, this process of looking at a terrible number and finding the shape of an opportunity inside it. He had gotten very good at it. "They're not doing this because it's a strong move," he said. "No," I agreed. "They're doing it because they've run out of other moves." 14 member species have voted for negotiation. 3 more are on the edge of neutrality. They've lost control of the supply corridors. They can't maintain sustained operations in 3 systems simultaneously anymore. This is not a strategy. I looked at the sensor feed, at 1,200 lights arranged in the shape of what someone else had decided was our ending. This is a statement. They need this to end, and they need it to end in a way that proves they were right to start it. But they weren't, Owen said. No. They were not. I pulled up the current EDF fleet composition. 912 warships. Plus 208 colony defense vessels being redirected from the outer settlements. Plus 41 vessels from allied and neutral species who had quietly offered material support, most of them officially described in Council records as transit vessels to maintain political cover. A total, when assembled, of approximately 1,160 ships. We were close to equal. Which was something that, 4 years ago, would have been the most astonishing statement in the history of human civilization. I authorized full fleet assembly at a coordinates point near the outer belt and began the process of moving every available vessel into position. It took 4 days. During those 4 days, I slept in 4-hour blocks, ate when someone put food in front of me, and spent the remaining hours in a continuous cycle of briefings, decisions, communications, and the particular kind of mental effort required to hold a picture of 1,100 ships across 400 million kilometers of space in your head clearly enough to make useful decisions about them. On the 4th day, Captain Abigail Croft sent me a message. It said, "Ready when you are. The 7th has been waiting for this one." I sent back, "Soon." The Council formation reached the outer system on the 4th day. They did not stop at Neptune this time. They came in steady and direct, no display formation, no open channel announcements. They were not putting on a show. They were past the phase of shows. The Battle of Seoul began on a Friday morning and lasted 3 days. I will not pretend to be able to give you the full picture of those 3 days in a way that is both accurate and comprehensible, because the honest truth is that a battle involving over 2,000 ships across the volume of the inner solar system does not have a coherent narrative from any single vantage point. It has moments. It has flashes of clarity inside a vast and complex noise. I will give you the ones I remember most clearly, because they are the ones that tell the real story. Hour 4. Pilot and Ensign Theo Marsh, 21 years old and the son of Bridget Marsh, who had written the surrender document for Harrow Station, was flying escort in a fighter wing protecting a carrier when the carrier took a hit that killed its propulsion system. Theo's wing held position around the carrier for 40 minutes, outnumbered 4-1, until a rescue and repair crew could reach them. He did not withdraw. When I asked him afterward why he had stayed, he said, very simply, they needed covering. His mother had taught him that the appropriate response to an impossible situation was to do the useful thing in front of you and trust that other people were doing the useful thing in front of them. That philosophy had survived a surrender document. It had traveled from Harrow Station to a fighter cockpit above the inner solar system. I find it important to record that. Hour 17. Communications Officer Grace Ellison, who had been running our signals intelligence team since year 2, identified the carrier frequency the Council fleet was using for real-time coordination. What she did with that identification was not in any protocol or manual, because it was not the kind of thing that exists in manuals. She flooded the frequency with a recording. The recording was a list of names. Every human name in the casualty database from the beginning of the war, every colonist from Harrow Station, every pilot from the Belt engagement, every person from the Indus Valley bombardment. Spoken aloud by a text-to-speech system in steady, clear, human voice. Over and over, cycling through the database for 3 hours. I heard about it during the battle and pulled the feed. I listened to it for about 30 seconds. I will be honest, I do not know precisely what effect it had on Council personnel. I do not know if the species listening to human names spoken in a human voice experienced anything that resembled what a human would experience hearing the same. What I know is that the Council's coordination frequency went dark for 9 minutes after Grace's broadcast began. 9 minutes of silence in the middle of a fleet engagement. When it came back up, something in the pattern of their communication had changed. It was faster, less structured. Like the difference between a practiced formation and a group of people who have just been startled. Grace told me afterward that she had not planned it. She had looked at the list of names on her screen and thought, they should hear this. So she put it on the channel. I recommended her for the highest commendation our military structure offers. She thanked me and went back to work. Hour 41. Council ship losses had reached approximately 450. Our losses stood at 112. The Council's formation had lost its coherence in the outer engagement zone and was attempting to consolidate around its core dreadnought group, a cluster of 28 heavy vessels that represented the flagship formation for the entire operation. We had 3 fleet groups in position to engage the dreadnought cluster. Captain Croft's 7th was one of them. I gave the order to converge. What followed, in the next 4 hours, was the most intense combat engagement in human history. The Council's core dreadnoughts were extraordinarily powerful. Their weapons were heavier than anything else we had faced. Their point defense systems were the best in their fleet. They fought with everything they had, because they had nothing left to hold back. But the 7th Fleet had Nadia Osei's dynamic shield system. And the 7th Fleet had Abigail Croft, who had been fighting this war for 4 years and had learned, in that time, the specific way that Council dreadnought commanders thought about engagement geometry. They always leave the same angle open, she told me once, months earlier, going over battle recordings. They've been trained to close the angles that their tactical doctrine identifies as critical. They're very good at it. But their doctrine was written before us. So there are angles their doctrine doesn't identify as critical, because no species they've faced has used them. She used them. When the dreadnought cluster's formation finally broke, in hour 46 of the battle, it broke from an angle that their tactical systems had rated as low priority. By the time they adjusted, the damage was done. Hour 58. The last Council vessel still in organized combat withdrew toward the fold space boundary. It was a single frigate, badly damaged, its running lights flickering in and out. We tracked it. We could have destroyed it easily. I gave the order to let it go. It carried a message, unencrypted, broadcasting on every available channel, a request for armistice talks. It was the Council's fleet command. What was left of it? I sat in my chair on the bridge of the Resolute, in the quiet that comes after 3 days of noise, and I looked at the tactical display. The Sol system around me was full of floating debris, damaged ships being towed to repair docks, emergency signals from vessels on both sides waiting for medical assistance. It was not a clean picture. It was not the kind of ending that feels the way endings are supposed to feel. I thought about a cold cup of coffee on a desk in Geneva 4 years ago. I thought about 72 hours on a countdown clock that had never been anything but a formality. I thought about Patrick Hale and his freighter full of food. I said, "Open a channel to the frigate." The Vethsari officer on the other end of the channel looked older than I expected. Older and very tired. He told me his name and his rank, and then he said that the Council's military command was requesting an immediate cessation of hostilities and the opening of formal peace negotiations. I looked at him for a moment. "Tell me," I said, "before we discuss terms. I would like to know, what did you think was going to happen? When you sent that fleet, what did you actually believe was going to happen?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. Then he said, in a voice that carried what I can only describe as genuine bewilderment, "We thought you would stop." "Why?" I asked. "Because," he said slowly, "every species stops. When the cost becomes great enough. When the losses become too large. Every species reaches that point and stops." I nodded. "And you believed we would reach that point?" "We calculated it precisely," he said. "Our models were very good." "I know," I said. "We saw your models. They were very good. They just had a missing variable." He looked at me. "What variable?" I thought about how to answer him. There were many ways to answer him. I had been thinking about it for 4 years, in one form or another, and I had arrived at the version that seemed most accurate and most honest. "You modeled our limitations," I said. "Our lifespan, our size, our resources, our history of conflict. You modeled everything that could be measured. But you did not model the thing that cannot be measured, which is what we do when we run out of options. We do not stop. We do not withdraw and recalculate. We get creative in ways that our previous behavior does not predict, because creativity is the response we evolved when our options ran out. We have been running out of options for 4 million years. We are very good at it." He said nothing. "Open the negotiation channel," I told him. "And please tell whoever is drafting your terms that they should start from the assumption that we are not going to accept anything that treats us as the lesser party. We are not lesser. We are just different." And different, it turns out, was the thing you should have taken seriously from the beginning. The armistice was signed 6 weeks later. The formal dissolution of the Galactic Council as a governing body occurred in the following 5 months, not because we demanded it, but because the internal fractures that had been building for years finally reached the point of irreversibility. 14 species chose bilateral treaties with Earth. 3 chose full partnership arrangements. The remaining species retained their independence under new frameworks negotiated without us. Patrick Hale was at the signing ceremony. He had been out of detention for 8 months by then, having been released as part of the preliminary ceasefire arrangements. He stood in the back of the room, a quiet man in a good suit, looking slightly overwhelmed by the occasion. I introduced myself afterward. He shook my hand and said he had heard my name before. I told him that I had heard his name first, and that I thought he should know that his decision to carry food to hungry people had, in the most indirect possible way, saved the species. He thought about this for a moment, and then said, in a very ordinary voice, "I just didn't want them to go hungry." "Yes," I said. "That is exactly what I mean." Bridget Marsh went back to Harrow Station 9 months after the armistice. She went back exactly as she had promised in her surrender document. The station had been maintained by a council administration during the occupation, and it was in reasonable condition, and the first thing she did when she stepped off the transport was look at the main hall, which was exactly as she had left it, and say, quietly and to no one in particular, right then, "Back to work." Harrow Station has a population of 19,000 today. Dr. Nadia Osei received the Global Science Laureate Award 3 years after the armistice. She gave a short speech in which she thanked her team, thanked the cargo bay at Ceres that had been her laboratory for 2 years, and said that the most useful thing she had ever learned was that the official list of what is possible is always shorter than the real list. Owen was promoted to commander and given his own assignment. He came to say goodbye and told me, in that careful way of his, that he had learned more in 5 years working under me than he had expected to learn in his entire career. I told him that I had learned from him too, which was true. The people who ask good questions in quiet voices are worth more than the people who make loud statements, in any situation, in any war, in any part of the long and improbable business of being alive. Captain Darnell Webb retired from service and went back to running an asteroid mining operation. He sent me a message on the anniversary of the belt engagement every year. Brief messages, just a few lines, always ending with the same sentence, "Still a lot of rocks out here. Good thing we know what to do with them." I kept every one. Abigail Croft stayed in the fleet. She is still there. She is now an admiral, commanding the 7th Fleet, which is no longer a damaged, rebuilt collection of ships finding its way back from a difficult year. It is one of the finest fleet groups in human space. She takes no credit for this, which is how you can tell she deserves all of it. And I am here, sitting on the steps of the rebuilt UN building in Geneva, on a morning in late autumn when the air is cold and clean and the sky above me is a shade of blue that does not exist on any other world I have ever visited, and I am thinking about everything that was said, in those early hours after the broadcast, about the numbers. 230 ships against 6,000. Small species. Short lives. Fragile bodies. Fractious, complicated, sometimes baffling politics. All of it true. None of it the whole story. The Council's mistake was not military. It was not strategic. It was not even political. It was philosophical. They looked at us and saw our limitations, and they concluded that our limitations defined us. They did not see what our limitations had made us. The ice ages that required us to adapt or disappear. The predators that required us to invent, cooperate, and innovate our way to survival. The countless generations of a species that had no particular physical advantage and chose to survive anyway, through stubbornness and creativity and a refusal to treat the available options as the complete list of options. They declared war on a species that had been in training for that war for 4 million years, without knowing it. They called our brief period of Council membership a history. It was not a history. It was a warm-up. Above me, a transport rises from the launch facility on the northern edge of the city. It is bound for the Kepler 62 colony, which was rebuilt 18 months after the armistice and is now home to 40,000 people. Bridget Marsh's surrender document is framed on the wall of the colony's main administrative building. The last paragraph, the one she added herself, the one the Council never required her to include, is the part that people stopped to read. She wrote that they would return. She wrote it as a certainty, not a hope. And she was right, because that is what humans do. We do not accept the conclusion that the numbers suggest. We take the options available to us and find the edges, and push, and find new options, and keep going. We are very old at being impossible. We are just getting started at being extraordinary. And somewhere out there, past the last star in any catalog we have yet completed, there is something we have not discovered. Something that does not know we exist. Something that cannot yet imagine what is coming. I hope, for their sake, they are quick learners. We are still reaching. We will not stop.